Hey, what's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Roll Pod, an Alabama sports podcast from Bama 247. I am staff writer Cody Goodwin, joined today by Mike Rodak, fellow staff writer at Bama 247. Mike, we're less than 100 days from week one of the 2024 college football season. Is that weird? I feel like that's weird. I feel like we got to this point in the calendar a lot faster, or at least it feels faster maybe than in previous years. You would know. You've been through more off seasons than I have.
100 days still seems like a lot, though. Honestly, it feels like it's closer to the football season. I don't know. Maybe it's just that dreaded feeling that once you kind of start summer, you kind of know that summer will end. Like I always felt that way in school. It was like, all right, the first day is summer, and then you're already thinking about you go to like Target or Walmart and you got like back to school stuff already. I'm sure the next couple weeks will be out there. So I don't know. It always feels like it's closer than it really is. 100 days is still a decent amount of time. Granted, it's still a lot sooner to get to SEC Media Days, which is only about 8 weeks away now, in the middle of July. And then, the start of fall camp is early August. So it's not 100 days until there's football again, but it's 100 days until Western Kentucky. So I don't know. It's been a busy off season without a doubt. You know, from the Rose Bowl until now, there's been a lot to talk about, but just kind of it feels like May. There's baseball happening and there's softball happening and there's kind of the last vestiges of the transfer portal. There's the SEC meetings going on, so it's May. It's going to be May, and it is May.
That might be the podcast title right there. It's going to be May, and it is May. Less than 100 days, so we've got quite a span of time here to fill content wise. So kind of similar to what we did last week with Scarborough. We're going to have a draft today to kind of discuss different elements and sides of the Alabama football team. We're going to do a non-quarterback draft today. Before we get to that, wanted to ask you about Damani Jackson. He did an interview with Inside the Circle podcast, and pretty lengthy interview that you ultimately wrote a story about. After you weaved through all the cuss words here and there, what ultimately did you learn about Damani Jackson, maybe specifically from that interview? What were your big takeaways?
Yeah, so this was a training center, an academy in Southern California that he was already familiar with, and they do a podcast. It's a former NFL player who does it, and we did not have a chance to talk to Damani Jackson in the spring, even with kind of the loosening of the rules as far as what Kalen DeBoer allows. They still didn't give us any new transfers and any new freshmen in the spring to talk to. So nobody's really talked to Damani Jackson from a Alabama media interview standpoint since he committed in December. But this was somebody that he was familiar with back home. Players are off for most of May. And so, he was back home and did the podcast, and, it's going back a ways in terms of his upbringing. And then going, he was a really highly rated, highly recruited kid that from the time that he really started at Mater Dei High School, which is obviously a powerhouse high school. It's where Bryce Young went. It's where a ton of players went in LA near Anaheim. He was always kind of considered the next big thing. He was even up to number 5 in the country, I think, before his sophomore year or after his sophomore year of high school in terms of our recruiting rankings at 247. So always had these expectations on him. And really in high school, I don't know if he ever fulfilled them fully because he had that great sophomore year. And then his junior year basically got wiped out because of COVID. And then I think he played like an abbreviated spring season as they did in California. And then he came back for his senior season, and the first couple minutes of his first game, he tore his knee up, which actually reminds me of Tyler Buckner. Speaking of California kids who went to Alabama, same experience. That was the story I wrote last summer. It was like Tyler Buckner was always this very highly rated, heralded kid, and his last year of high school, he missed time because of COVID in California too. And then his last year of high school, his first game, he tore his knee up on a fake punt or something. So it's interesting kind of the parallels there I was thinking about, but I think the underlying theme was like untapped potential as a high schooler, but still went to USC, picked USC over Alabama. And I remember that commitment coming down to the wire that fall of 2021. and just never really was the player that people thought he would be at USC, and had another knee injury that he suffered, his freshman year. And then came back his sophomore year last year and started, but obviously USC's defense was pretty bad last year, and I think he was a target of some of that criticism as well. So he was pretty candid about people doubting him and talking about him, and kind of the USC pipeline not always working out for players, and also candid about coming to Alabama, and how Nick Saban wanted him again. In fact, he was silently committed to Alabama
Hmm.
uh, at one point, coming into high school or coming out of high school into college, and even talked about in the locker room the day after Nick Saban retired. He said every player was talking about leaving, and then he came back in the next day, and he wasn't going to leave because he had just come, and he wasn't going to turn back around and go out the door. And he said all the other players are still there, and he's saying y'all were talking about leaving, but you're still here. So there's a lot of good honest content from Damani. And again, it was 90 minutes long. It was a good podcast, so I'd recommend people go and find out on YouTube and listen to it. And I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk to him in fall camp, but at this point I think he's he's kind of given his testimony, if you will. He's given his story, and I think there's definitely a chip on his shoulder there. And again, a guy who has not really lived up to his recruiting rating, but has a lot of potential and a lot of opportunity in this defense too, because he's their top cornerback. There's kind of by default, like you lose Kool-Aid, you lose Terrion, and you lose Trey Amos, you lose a couple other guys, and you have a bunch of freshmen coming in, and Damani Jackson's the one veteran now with Deshaun Jones coming in as well from Wake Forest, but Damani's their number one guy, and they're going to need a lot out of him this year, if this defense is going to be what it potentially can be.
He kind of like you mentioned, kind of default cornerback one through the spring. We'll see if he's able to maybe hold off, either a transfer or some of the freshmen come fall camp. But I kind of thought it was a little cool that, he obviously came to Alabama like many defensive backs have over the years because of Nick Saban. And then even though Saban retires, he's like, yeah, I think I'm cool here, and maybe that was, as I was reading that, I'm like, I wonder if he was one of the first guys to really kind of buy into DeBoer and Kane Womack. And, he spoke pretty highly of Lindquist, and they kind of have a little bit of a thing because Mo was at Michigan
briefly
while they were recruiting Jackson. So there's that connection there. I guess the one big question I do have, and this, we may not be able to answer this fully until August. I was not particularly high on him coming out of USC because I was like, man, like this, just not great numbers, not great stats. He got beat a few too many times for my liking. Obviously, he comes to Alabama thinking he's going to play for Saban. What do we think it's going to take, or what's the magical formula here to get the most out of Jackson? Like, what do we think needs to happen for him to kind of reach that sky high potential?
Well, I think humility, hard work are all pretty important things. And he talked about that as a 5-star recruit. Like, it doesn't matter if you come in and have that rating. If somebody is more consistent playing behind you, then they're going to play ahead of you, even if their ranking's not quite as high. And in this case, they actually have 3 5-stars behind him. But, I think you could sense a little bit of what Nick Saban talks about sometimes about 5-stars, is that it's so easy for them in high school that they don't always do everything they need to do. And Damani kind of acknowledged that and admitted that. And sometimes they would just tell him in high school, just go guard the guy. And there wasn't a whole lot of thought and, football IQ that went into it. And he admitted that he struggled a little bit with the football IQ portion of USC's defense. And, if he had played for Nick Saban, I'm sure that would have been potentially an issue, because Nick Saban's defense is very complicated. He asks a lot out of his corners with pattern matching. And it would have been really intriguing to see how that relationship would have unfolded. It's probably a little bit simpler with Kane Womack. The vision coverage, just go get the ball and go get turnovers, and that's kind of what Damani said. So maybe that helps him a little bit, but I think having good habits and having the right mindset is going to be important. And not to say that he didn't have that at USC, but again, he acknowledged that he didn't play up to his, or didn't showcase his talents the way that he thought he could have. And, You have to close that capability gap, as Nick Saban likes to call it. And so it's just a matter of, is he going to do everything he needs to do at Alabama in order to do that? And look, if he does that and he has a really good year, are we talking about Damani Jackson as a first or second round pick next spring? Like, I don't think it's out of the question. Look what Terry and Arnold just did. Like, you have the potential, you're draft eligible, you're going to have the opportunity in this defense to start. If you have a really strong year, you're going to be on that radar in the spring. And if not, maybe get one more year out of them. But, it's going to be an interesting position. I think we talked about that in the show a couple weeks ago, where corner is a really unknown sort of spot for this team with a lot of different options and a lot of players that could be really good, and this could be a really good secondary, but it could also be an issue if some of these freshmen don't play well or early. If Damani Jackson doesn't play well, like, there's going to be a lot of heat on those guys. So there's a pretty wide range of outcomes for that position. I think that includes, Damani himself.
Yeah. Well, and you made a good point about, Kane Womack's defense, like maybe not asking as much, maybe not as complicated for the defensive back. So maybe that kind of helps him get up to speed a little bit, allows his athleticism to shine a little bit. And like you said, like, there's going to be a ton of opportunity here. They've got so many moving pieces in the defensive backfield that he's going to get the opportunity. So I think at this point, it's just a matter of taking advantage of the opportunity. Really enjoyed that story. If you enjoy learning about some of Alabama's new players, go check out Mike's story, Bama247.com. Speaking of the importance of the defensive backfield, we are going to discuss the importance of Alabama's roster way ahead of the 2024 season. Like we said, less than 100 days to week 1. We got a lot of time here between now and really SEC media days. That's kind of, more or less the launching point into fall camp, which then kind of brings us to the season at full. So how are we going to fill that time? We, like last week, are going to do another draft. Last week, Scarborough and I drafted the schedule in terms of games we found most interesting, most looking forward to, what intrigues us. We even made the Mercer game interesting. Go back and listen to that if you haven't listened to it yet. Today, Mike and I are going to do a non-quarterback draft. Just kind of the players that we feel are going to be most important or most critical to Alabama's success in 2024. And I say it's a non-quarterback draft because we're going to take the quarterback position, put it over here to the side. I think we're all in agreement that the quarterback position is probably the most important role for Alabama in 2024. So we're just going to focus on everybody else. A couple of rules here for this draft. We both need to pick at least one offensive player. We both need to pick at least one defensive player. We both need to pick at least one transfer. And we both need to pick at least one freshman. And then we can kind of have a fifth flex player. So we're each going to pick 5 players. Again, most important Alabama players as it pertains to the 2024 season, as we see it right now here in late May. Mike, you got the first overall pick. Who are you going with?
Caden Proctor. I think that has to be one where we all remember what happened early last season, and that was a position that was problematic for them. It was, and the huge sack numbers, you can ask Saban, you can ask anybody, was not just on the offensive line. It was not just Caden Proctor. Jalen Miller, I think, deserves some blame for it, just kind of the overall operation. So, hopefully for Alabama's case, that's improved, with Jalen Milroe, and kind of tailing DeBoer's offense. But there's also a lot of line checks and things that will have to happen in his offense. But in terms of like physical one-on-one, you got to beat the guy in front of you. It's still going to be important for Caden Proctor to be that good pass blocker for Jalen Milroe for this all to work. So, it's the left tackle position. It's always at a premium. Obviously they were thrilled to get Caden Proctor back and have him change his mind about going to Iowa, essentially. But it was an up and down year too, because again, I think we talked about it before. He had a great game against Georgia in the SEC championship game, did not play as well against Michigan. There was a lot of issues with pass protection and sacks in that Michigan game. Not just him again, but it felt like a little bit earlier in the season. It was kind of a throwback game in that regard. And if they have that happen again this year, then it's going to be a problem, for Milroe. So, I think it starts at left tackle. It starts with Caden Proctor for me.
That makes so much sense. And if you want the optimistic version of Caden Proctor, really after the bye week last year, he was he was good. He was very good in the SEC championship game. He was very good against Georgia, right? Like he took his lumps early. Obviously he was, baptism by fire, right? A younger true freshman, right? The younger side of the true freshman side of things. Took him a while to figure some things out. He struggled with speed early on. That South Florida game was abysmal. There were a few different games where he just kind of took it on the chin a little bit. But then after the bye week, he seemed to have figured a lot of things out, played a lot better, turned into a fairly competent option. If they can get that version of Caden Proctor back at the beginning of the season, and we'll see obviously how that goes. That does a lot for Alabama's offensive line, right? Because like you're protecting the quarterback's blind side, right? All the quarterbacks are right-handed. That's huge, right? We think the interior is going to be good. So then you're really only worried about the right tackle spot. And I'd like to think that Kalen DeBoer's offensive mastermind can find ways to maybe scheme around some sort of issue, and especially like, again, I think I've said this before on the podcast, like quarterback's right-handed, you're looking at the right tackle while you're cocking back to throw. Like you can see the danger coming at you. Whereas like the blind side, you can't really see the danger coming at you. So that kind of, helps the quarterback in a sense, if that's the only hole you got to worry about. But, those who Scarborough and I talked about this last week. He talked with Duke Manyweather from OL Masterminds out in Dallas, who has trained a lot of high-profile offensive linemen at the collegiate and NFL level. And he had a lot of good things to say about Caden Proctor, even though he wasn't there for spring ball and he was kind of going back and forth between Iowa and Alabama. Things seem to be trending in the right direction to get a more competent version of Caden Proctor to start the season for Alabama.
Yeah. And it's obviously I'm just drafting one player, but I think the right tackle spot too is pretty important. And from a run blocking standpoint, probably more so because JC Latham was such a good run blocker. He's just a monster in terms of his power and strength and size. Elijah Pritchett's a different body type. Like you stand those two guys up next to each other last year. Elijah Pritchett's much thinner, a little bit more kind of lanky, long arms. Like it's a different sort of body than JC Latham. So if it is Pritchett starting at right tackle, and there's other options. There's Miles McVay. There's Wilkin Formby. I guess technically Naquil Bertrand, the A&M transfer could potentially play out there. He hasn't really yet, I don't think. But there's options. But if it is Pritchett, like, are they as good in the run game as they were last year with Latham? That's a high bar to cross in terms of what Latham gave them at right tackle last year. So, you might get better at left tackle if you have a better version of Caden Proctor than what he was on the whole last year. But are you getting worse at right tackle? And does that kind of even things out in terms of the tackle position overall? That's something to consider as well. But it's a position where they've lost a lot of guys to the portal. So to get one back in Caden Proctor certainly helps. But it's a spot where they need to continue to recruit because that's, they did a really good job with recruiting with Evan Neal and Latham and a lot of guys going back for, quite a ways. And, I don't want to say they've missed on some guys, but I think the coaching transitions probably hurt them a little bit. Mason Short going elsewhere to Georgia, I believe. David Sanders, I think, was on their radar, who's a really highly rated 2025 kid. So not only am I concerned about the current tackle state, but also kind of the future, who's their next tackle coming in? Because right now their 2025 class does not include one. And, if you can't find one next year, you're probably looking in the portal again.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a good point. Caden Proctor, number 1 overall pick, perhaps in this draft, and maybe if he lives up to his billing, number 1 overall in the NFL draft here in a couple of years. Clip this. We'll come back to it. Number 2 overall. I'm going to take a little bit of the safer pick because I'm just not sure how I want this draft to go. I'm going to go Tim Keenan, the 3rd, number 2 overall, defensive lineman. He took some pretty big steps last year, right? Kind of toiling on the bench for the first couple years of his career. And then last year he stepped into the starting lineup and was just a beast. Played the run really well, was able to pressure the quarterback up the middle. I think part of that was just offenses having to pay a little bit more attention to Turner, Braswell, and at times Aboigbe. So that kind of allowed Tim Keenan to shine a little bit more. going to need another step up, I think, this year, because you look at just the way Kane Walmack's defense is kind of built, vision on the quarterback, jumping and making plays and really kind of limiting the big plays. It would help if you have a consistent disruptive presence in the middle, or just on the defensive line in general. Tim Keenan just so happens to play in the middle, just really kind of disrupting the timing and being able to put more pressure on the quarterback and kind of get them out of rhythm a little bit, just anywhere on the defensive line, but specifically Tim Keenan. If he can do that while continuing to play the run, while continuing to just kind of be that disruptive presence in the middle, I'd like to see him take another step forward, because I think if he does that, it just unlocks a lot for this defense. And also, it's been a few years since Alabama's had kind of that game wrecker, take over the game type player on the defensive line. Like, they've had Dallas Turner, they've had Will Anderson, they've had other dudes who can do that, but it's been a while since they've had one on the D line. I'd like to think that, I'm real high on Jamarian Latham too. I think he could have a really big breakout year, but in terms of just like overall importance, like if Tim Keenan can become that guy, maybe not every game, but more often than not, it just opens up, I think, so much more for this Alabama defense. So I'd like to see him take another step forward. And, I think his ability to do that's pretty important for Alabama's defense in 2024.
We're building through the trenches with our first round picks. I like it.
You got to start big if you want to win, right? Like, that's, football may be pass happy nowadays, but you still got to block. You still got to take down the blocks, right?
That's right.
What did you think of Tim Keenan's overall season last year? And do you think he has the capability to maybe step into that game wrecker role this year?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of out of the blue. Was a guy that didn't really play his first 2 years at Alabama.
Yeah.
Kind of just, you think like last year's team, guys who really didn't get on the field, like a Curtis Perry or Monkel Goodwine, or there's a few other defensive linemen they had, the last couple of years that just didn't play. And you kind of had him in that barrel for a while. Like, all right, this guy's probably not going to make it here. And then all of a sudden you start hearing the name in last spring and fall camp, and he's losing all this weight and becoming a really disruptive player, and then basically becomes a starter for him. So, you don't see that happen all the time where there's a kind of a rapid ascension like that, but it certainly happened for him. And yeah, we talk about it a lot where Alabama's not had that disruptive inside guy. I think, honestly, if Christian Barmore had stayed another year or two, he probably would have been that player. He left really early. Like, he had one season really as like a rotational guy, and he went to the NFL as a third-round pick, and now is the highest rated or highest paid player in Patriots history, other than
he's
Tom Brady.
Monster. Yeah.
Right. Great player in the NFL. Never really had enough runway in college. He was a redshirt sophomore when he came out. He would have been that guy, I think. But other than him, the last 5 years, they just haven't had that. And, there's a lot of reasons for it. I think some of those high level defensive line recruits have just gone to other schools, and maybe they think they weren't going to be as statistically productive in Nick Saban's defense, where defensive linemen are kind of eating up space. Maybe there's more of an opportunity for some of those guys in Kane Wommack's defense. We've heard Freddie Roach we've heard Jamarian Latham talk about how there's more freedom for that bandit position in particular to kind of do some other things. And I think Jamarian Latham even likened it to high school, where you could kind of go out there and pass rush and freelance a little bit, where Nick Saban, you're just kind of, you're playing the 5 technique and 2 gapping and just kind of eating up blocks. So maybe that helps with trying to find that more disruptive player. Is it Keenan? I don't know. Like, I think there's certainly an opportunity for him to have another really good year. And if he does, I think he's at least a mid-round pick next year if he comes out. And I think there was probably some thought of him coming out last year. I think he even put out a tweet saying he was coming back, which implies that there was a chance that he wouldn't. And, he'll be 4 years in at this point next year. So, you might have your last year of Tim Keenan this year, but is he a first round pick like Quinnen Williams or, Jonathan Allen or one of those guys? Probably not. I'd probably put him more in the Phil Mathis, Byron Young category of guys, Justin Boygby, who have been 3rd or 4th round picks.
Yeah. Well, and if he can be just, for his personal sake, if he can be just as productive as he was last year in this defense, that I think that would show scouts a little bit of versatility, that like you played in 2 different defensive sets. Maybe there's some similar are similarities between what, Saban asked of his D line and what Womack asked of his D line. But if he can put up similar numbers, okay, like you can, he's not scheme specific, right? You can just kind of drop him in and he's going to go do what he does, which, I'd like to think that's probably a 4th round floor, like maybe late day 2 type guy. Like that's, we're thinking real big picture here, but for his personal sake, yeah, I think this is a big year for him in terms of, his future and potentially playing in the NFL. And he did a interview with Yay Alabama last year too, where he talked about the Birmingham to Alabama pipeline and how there's just a lot of guys that went from Birmingham to Alabama. And now they're, obviously doing big things in the league, and he wants to live up to that.
Was one I covered in Buffalo from Bessemer. Obviously, great player at Alabama, and probably a player too who never really reached his full potential at Alabama either. He was kind of a rotational guy and ended up being the 3rd overall pick, for the Patriots or for the Bills in 2011.
Started in that national championship game against Texas, though, so good for him.
Fun guy. He was a fun guy to talk to in that Bills locker room. I'll say that.
Number 3 overall pick. Who you got?
So we need one offense, one defense, but I can
transfer in a freshman.
But it doesn't have to be that order, right?
No, you can.
Okay.
Whatever.
So I'm going to use my flex.
Okay.
I'm going to talk about Jeremy Bernard.
Ooh.
I think he's going to be an important player for this offense. And, we've kind of had to debate one of our last shows when all 3 of us were on kind of like where Jeremy Bernard is. Because you can make the argument that he was kind of stuck behind some really good players at Washington, all 3 of those draft picks. And
all 3 top 100 draft picks.
Right. And now he steps into the number 1 role in Alabama. And,
right.
Is he being elevated beyond where he should be right now? Or, is this was he stuck behind those guys at Washington? He was always the number 1 guy all along. Like, I don't know. Like, we're going to find out. And I think there's still a lot of variables between Jalen Milroe as a passer and the offensive line and all that. So I guess I'm just saying, like, I don't know if it's going to be quite all dandy all the time, where Jeremy Bernard just has this easy breakout season. Like it could be, the last couple of years, like Jermaine Burton was good in spurts, but it wasn't like you're thinking every single week, this guy's a true number 1. This guy's a all SEC type of player. Like, it never came together that consistently for Burton. And part of that was probably, on Milroe last year. So, I might put Bernard in the same category. I don't know what to think about him, but I think he's important because they've lost some guys at wide receiver, whether it's Burton or Bond or, just the guys that they've lost before that. Like and
Nyblack was a tight end, but he more or less operated like a big slot receiver too.
Right. There's a big opportunity for him. I just want to see, if he fulfills it right away. And I think we'll probably both draft the same freshman, and we're probably thinking of the same guy who's also a wide receiver. But like, again, there's a lot to ask of Ryan Williams right away to be that number 1. And, Jeremy Bernard is that number 1 right now. So that's why I think he's important. I don't know if Kendrick Law or Kobe Prentice is going to be putting up, again, all SEC type of numbers, being your number 1 wide receiver. I think they're good players in kind of their own little regions. But Bernard has a lot on his shoulders to be that guy for this offense.
Yeah. Well, and the interesting part here too is like when you factor in Jalen Hale's injury, like Jalen Hale's kind of their prototypical X guy. Like you put him outside, he's a burner down the sideline. Jeremy's kind of, a cross between an X and a slot. Like I feel like he can do a lot of different things, and he's a pretty big dude, right? 6'1", 200, like for a receiver, right? So there's multiplicity, I think, in his game, pretty big route tree. Shepard obviously loves him in the wide receiver room. He obviously loves the staff and the scheme that they're going to run. So where are they going to put him, right? Because the lack of Hale like kind of opens up the X role. Do they put him there? Okay, then what does that mean for guys like Prentice and Ryan Williams? Do they put him somewhere else? Okay, who's the big body out wide? Is that where Caleb Odom goes? Is Caleb Odom even going to play a lot this year? Like there's, that's what I think I'm most curious about when it comes to the receiver room. Like, what are the roles? Because when Hale is there, you can you put him at the X, and it kind of limits where you put everybody else, so to speak. So I think once they kind of figure out where Jeremy goes on a play-to-play basis, that kind of sets the tone for who else gets some significant playing time, right? Like who goes into the slot, who's that other underneath guy? Like, do they have those roles, right? Do they run more multiple tight end sets? Do they put Justice and Jam on the field at the same time? Like there's just a lot of, like they did very first play of A-Day, they ran pony personnel, right? 2 running backs on the field. Like, I don't know. Like, and it's one of those things where it's like, we may not know until week 1 against Western Kentucky, for as much as we're hoping to gain out of fall camp, we just don't know, and that's one of the more intriguing parts, I think, about this offense.
Yeah, no, I agree.
4th overall pick. I'm going to continue building through the trenches. I'm going with Parker Brailsford. He's my transfer. I like.
Wait, sorry, 1 sec. So Bernard counts as my transfer, but not my. I still have a flex to use, then, right?
You can put him as your transfer. Or you can put him as your flex.
Okay, I'll put him as your transfer for now.
You put him as the transfer for now.
I don't want to mess up this draft. I'll put him as a transfer. I'll keep my flex open.
See, this is what makes this draft interesting. You put it like we didn't have rules for the scheduled draft, so we've got rules
here.
What?
Your strategy here. You got to make sure that
you gotta be smart
right way here.
You got to be smart. I'm going with Parker Brailsford. He's my transfer. Just obvious, like the center issues last year are well documented by now. Like I don't need to rehash all of that. Like that is just one level of importance for Parker Brailsford, but also like DeBoer's offense, right? Like pro style with some spread concepts. A lot is going to be asked out of the quarterback. A lot is going to be asked out of the center, right? And so now you've got this center that anchored, last year's Joe Moore award-winning offensive line. I'm kind of curious to see how much is going to be asked of the center. Like, are they going to rely on Brailsford to make calls and checks at the offensive line? Is it going to be kind of a tandem thing? Is it going to be more on Milroe? That's something he really didn't do a lot last year. Is that something DeBoer is going to have to ask of him? Or if he's not the quarterback, Ty Simpson, whatever the case may be. So they need to be on the same page there. The importance of the offensive line has been stressed, right? You and I both picked 2 offensive linemen here in the top 4 in terms of, importance for Alabama in 2024. And all of this is compounded because like he just was not there during the spring. Like we just haven't seen him. Like where's he at mentally? Where is he at physically? Like DeBoer is saying all the right things, but we don't know. And this just may be something that we just don't know until fall camp or even week 1 against Western Kentucky. Like if he is not ready to go, your primary backup now plays for TCU, James Brockermeyer, right? And they were gushing over him over spring ball, and he decided that he wanted to go somewhere else to play because he figured that Brailsford's going to be here. As long as he's here, like that's a crucially important part of what Alabama does offensively. If he's not, man, that offensive line that has the potential to be, I think, pretty good this year may not be. Like that's, I don't know, crucially important
for Geno Vandermark, to step in. But I think it's okay to have both sides of it covered. Like it's okay to support Parker Brailsford and like you said, for Alabama and DeBoer to do all the right things, say all the right things, but it's also fair and reasonable to have some level of doubt about his availability, about his just his entire state, to go out there and play SEC football, which is mentally draining. It's a grind. It's going to be even more of a grind, with the 12-team playoff and the expansion to 16. Like it's hard. So, I think it's fair to have some level of doubt just on his ability to do all that. I think that's a completely reasonable thought to have, alongside the thought that you're going to do everything to support him and stay behind him. I think you can have both of those be active at the same time. So that's the point I want to make there. But I think Brailsford's a very good pick for your team in this draft.
In terms of importance too. And the other point I wanted to make too is like, Vandermark, great interior swing guy, right? Like Power 5 starter, Power 4 starter, or whatever. We're Power 5, Power 4.
Power 4 now. Get used
Power
to
4.
it.
Power 4 starter. So it was in the Big Ten. So like, he's used to high level football. But But what worries me is that if they have to go to Vandermark, like he doesn't know the offense like Brailsford does. He probably doesn't know the checks and calls as much. He came in the spring window, so he didn't have the spring practices to kind of get up to speed. He's going to have to do a lot of work this summer and through fall camp to kind of get caught up to speed, which means a lot of it's on his own. So I guess we're going to learn a lot about Vandermark's work ethic if he ends up having to be in spot duty while Brailsford, gets his stuff together. But I think that just kind of stresses the importance a little bit more of Brailsford, what he brings to the table, and what's ultimately going to be expected out of him in this Alabama offense.
Yeah, no doubt.
Number 5 overall pick. Who you got?
So I'm going to make my defensive pick, and I'm going to go with Deontay Lawson for
Ooh.
multiple reasons. Number one, and we've talked about this before, but again, I feel like I keep saying that because it's May, and we're talking about the last football that we saw. And the last football that we saw was the Rose Bowl outside of A-Day. And to be honest, neither of them were that great for Deontay Lawson. There was issues with him in A-Day. There was issues with him in the Rose Bowl. He was dealing with the ankle injury. In the Rose Bowl, he had 2 separate ankle injuries last year. And, I don't know if there's ever really a serious thought of him coming out in the draft last year. I'm not sure if he would have gone all that high. Like if you ask me, and I didn't really research him as a prospect because it wasn't really a thing, but probably a late round pick. Like I don't think he was ever going to be an early round pick last year, given his tape. So, there's potential there. He was a pretty highly rated kid coming out. I think he had a really good year 2 years ago. As he started to emerge and started to play some more. And this will be a very important year for him to try to get up that draft board and be a, day 2 pick potentially. So there's that, just improving as a player. But there's also the aspect of this is completely new in terms of the defense. And he's also going to be the guy that's wearing the green dot, which is also new. Because I asked him after A-Day, I said, were you wearing the green dot? He said, yeah. And that's going to be different. Getting those calls from Kane Womack, getting calls that are new to him, running this new defense. So just from that standpoint, he's going to be an important player for them this year. And mechanics of doing things that's not hand signals anymore, or it's not hand signals from the sideline anymore, but now he's getting in his ear. He's sending the hand signals to other players. That's all going to be something. There's going to be a learning curve there. And I still can't get past the Khalil Jacobs thing, because some of those quotes from Khalil Jacobs too were interesting. When he was talking to Brett Greenberg, and as we know, Khalil Jacobs was the South Alabama linebacker who played for Kane Womack, was a transfer, ended up visiting Alabama, Auburn, Missouri, ended up committing to Missouri earlier last week. So he's not going to Alabama, but he did mention talking about his potential role at Alabama. And he said, instead of having to learn a whole new playbook, I can go on and even help some guys who are struggling catching on with the newness of the defense, which just my red flag went up. Like, is there something there that we don't know about necessarily, or that Kane Womack and Khalil Jacobs have talked about with Deontay Lawson or Jihad Campbell or their backups, Justin Jefferson or Jeremiah Alexander? Why was there legitimate interest in Alabama's part when they already had 2 inside linebackers? Why was Khalil Jacobs legitimately considering Alabama? Was he just being looked at as a depth piece? Like, I don't know. I feel like there was an opportunity maybe for him to start. And I wonder, what that path would have been and if it would have involved Deontay Lawson at all. So maybe I'm just putting my tinfoil hat on and making up conspiracy theories, but sometimes your spidey senses on some of these things, your antenna goes up a little bit. So Deontay Lawson's a player that just still missing a little bit in my eyes, like still wanted to see a little bit more out of him. And just a guy that I think a lot of people are going to have eyes on this year. And, a lot of people had eyes on him in the Rose Bowl, and they saw that play down the right sideline where he just did not look right and was not able to make that play on that touchdown. So, again, that if that happens again this year, there's going to be a lot of criticism thrown his way.
No, I think that's totally fair. And he's very talented, right? Like he's a thumper. He's fast. He moves really quickly laterally. I think the injury thing is probably to me, like I obviously Chief first and foremost, right? Just because of Alabama's depth in the middle linebacker role, like both him and Jihad Campbell have dealt with injuries. I think if they're both 100% healthy and they both play to their capabilities, could be the best inside linebacker duo in the SEC, perhaps one of the best in the country. That said, you start there, right? On top of that, like Lawson just had moments last year where it's almost like he was guessing which gap he had to run through or what maybe his assignment was, or he kind of got lost on what his assignment was. And it happened enough where it was just like, all right, like what are you doing there? When like he knew exactly what he had to do on certain plays, he was magnificent. Like he was great at just identifying like where the running back was, who he had to get in coverage. He was excellent blitzing. Because he's just he's fast enough for a middle linebacker to where he's able to shoot through the gap and he's, hands up in the quarterback's face immediately. I guess I just raise your floor a little bit. Like, don't guess, like make sure you know what you're doing play to play. Just little, when you're as good of an athlete as he is, like we're going to pick nits a little bit like that. Cause I think, he's good. He's got the potential to be great. And I think Alabama probably needs the great version of Deontay Lawson if they want this defense to really hum in the way that they're hoping this season.
Yeah. I mean, you're talking about a guy who was a top 30 prospect in 247 coming out in 2021. So now we're talking 2024. Like you're expecting a top 30 prospect to be an all SEC type of player, like pushing all American. Like his scouting report from Andrew Ivins was CJ Mosley. His scouting report was a first round pick. He's not that right now, but you feel like there's potential for him to make that next step, and this is the year for him to do it.
Yeah. No, I like that pick a lot. Number 6 overall, I think I'm going to make I had Brailsford as my transfer pick, Keenan as my defense pick. I'm going to do my flex pick with Keon Sabb. I think this is not how I'm going to mean it, but this is how I'm going to say it. He's the Caleb Downs replacement, right? Like Downs was strong safety last year. He was magnificent. Like everybody who listens to this show in any capacity knows how much I love watching Caleb Downs last year. Keon Sabb now has to take that role. Keon Sabb is not Caleb Downs so far as we know, right? Like maybe he can provide, the B plus version of what Caleb Downs brought last year. And if he does that, I think Kane Womack's going to be tickled. That might be the ceiling, but like, this is a guy that's got championship pedigree, right? Like he came from Michigan, very clearly a talented player. He's got rapport with some of the coaches. And this is a place that he wanted to be, right? So it's going to be him at strong safety. You're going to have Malachi Moore at free safety, some combination of King Mack, Devonta Smith, maybe somebody else at that, the new, was it Husky position, formerly known as Star, right? So, I think there's just a lot of expectation for him to, because Caleb Downs cleaned up a lot of stuff last year and he did a lot of great stuff on the back end too. Like that versatility is what made him great. And it's probably what's going to make him one of the best college football players in the country for the next 2 years. Can Keon Sabb provide you with like 80 to 85% of what Caleb Downs did last year? If he does that, I think Alabama is going to be really, really happy. And I think they're going to need that just based on what they want to do defensively, right? Because Kane Womack's defense, right? Like, you mentioned how it's different than the pattern match man applying pressure on the quarterback. Like that's what Nick Saban's defense was. Kane's is more like, we're going to keep everything in front of you. We're going to jump routes. We're going to read the quarterback's eyes. If we can get pressure, great, but it's more about kind of limiting the big play. Downs did that a lot last year. Can Keon Sabb do that a lot this year? And if he does that, I think that'll also be another piece to Alabama's defense in terms of what's the most successful version of it look like. It needs a really, really good version of Keon Sabb.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I agree. I think, Sabb and Moore, you can make an argument for both. Malachi Moore making a position change and being that leader and fifth-year guy. Like I think you can, draft him as well as a defensive player. So either one of those guys.
Yeah. Well, and I think, more by virtue of playing the star position the last few years, he's kind of shown that like he also has that little bit of versatility. Like he can cover, like that's what really got him on the field as a true freshman, right? Like his ability to cover and play that star position. So, we kind of know he has that in his bag. Like I think Keon Sabb has that in his bag, right? Like we've seen a few things here and there that, shows that he's probably a good cover guy, but just, how he fits in the defense, like he's got to be able to kind of, like I keep leaning on the Caleb Downs example, but like Caleb Downs is almost not solely, but a very large reason why Alabama beat A&M last year. Can Keon Sabb bring that type of impact on a week-to-week basis? If he can do that, Alabama's defense, I think, is going to be in a pretty good spot, at least the defensive backfield, right? Because then you've got, then you feel really good about your safeties back there. And then it's a matter of how fast can the corners get up to speed.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Number 7 overall pick. Who you got?
I got my freshman, and I got the obvious one. I'll take Ryan Williams. I think that it has to be that. Maybe you'll draft Xavier Brown or somebody as your freshman. I think that's reasonable, but Ryan Williams is, to me, going to be the difference in terms of how far he comes along as a freshman. Is going to be the difference between Alabama being one of the best offenses in the country or being something closer to what it was last year, which was not the best offense in the country. It was, in fact, one of the worst offenses of the Nick Saban era statistically last year. So I think Ryan Williams is going to be the difference between being really, really good and being just good on offense, because we've talked about it extensively the last couple of years, the last year with you specifically, but really the last 2 years, and how they've lacked that top end sort of receiver that they had, when this offense was number 1, number 2 in the country and just beating people, scoring 50 points every week. Like, he's that player that would unlock that, I think, for them again. But it's asking a lot for him as a freshman. And I was just looking up, some of the best freshman wide receiver seasons in history. And, there's been a few of them who have popped recently. Rondale Moore at Purdue in 2018, David Bell at Purdue in 2019. But really not a whole lot. Like, you had kind of like the best one was probably Mike Williams at USC in 2002. He had 81 catches as a freshman for a heck of a lot of yards, 1,200 yards, 14 touchdowns. Like, if Ryan Williams does that for Alabama this year, then watch out. Like, you're talking, Biletnikoff, contender, and a player, all SEC type of player. And look, that's what made a big difference for Alabama in 2020. Like, Mac Jones would have been a little bit more pedestrian as a quarterback if Devontae Smith didn't have the season that he had, especially after Jalen Waddle went down that year. So that does make a big difference. And as I talked about with Bernard, I think there's still questions on him making that jump from number 4 to number 1. And there's still questions about what the ceiling is for Kendrick Law and Kobe Prentice. And Ryan Williams is undoubtedly the guy who walks into that room with the highest ceiling when he gets there, or really when he's here this week. And so it's just a matter of how quickly it comes together, how quickly he learns the offense, how quickly he gets the trust of Jamarcus Shepard and Nick Sheridan and Kalen DeBoer to go out there and to, do everything he needs to do as a receiver, which is not just go out and catch passes. It's going to be his run blocking. It's going to be, again, knowing the playbook and knowing his motions and his reads and all that. And then his relationship with Jalen Milroe and what their chemistry is as well. So we'll just have to see. That's going to be something that we're going to be watching more than anything else in fall camp. But if that comes together, and that comes together in a really big way this year for Alabama, then he's not just the most important freshman. He's probably the most important player on this team.
No pressure, kid, right?
Yeah.
Here's a fun bit of obvious trivia. So Rondale Moore, 1,000-yard receiver in 2018. David Bell, 1,000-yard receiver in both 2019 and 2021. Guess who Purdue's receivers coach was those years?
I don't know.
Jamarcus Shepard.
Was it?
Yes.
He wasn't at Western Kentucky. All right. Interesting.
He was Purdue's pass game coordinator and receivers coach in 2017, and then the co-OC and receivers coach 2018 through 2021.
I forgot about he was at Purdue.
So maybe if you want,
you got as a story idea.
Look at that, right? So if you like, I'm nervous about Ryan Williams because he's not very big. Like, I hope he spent all spring in the weight room so that, because he's like, what, 6'1", 165, I think is what he was listed as, 247. Like, I would prefer, 6'1", 1.5, whatever his total measurement is, like, get up to like 180, 185, something like that. Just because like SEC players hit hard, man. And I just don't want to see him go over the middle. Linebacker comes shooting across, and then, he's going to have to miss the rest of his freshman season. But the optimistic view here is that Ryan Williams is this otherworldly talent stepping into a room with a lot of talented guys. I agree that he's probably got the highest ceiling, and he's going to be working with a coach that knows how to take talent like this and get the most out of it, right? And if you're also worried about the size thing like me, Rondale Moore, 5'7", 181. 1,000-yard receiver for Purdue in 2018. David Bell was a little bit bigger, so maybe that's the Jeremy Bernard role there. More like 6'2", 212 or something like that. So, yeah, like Ryan Williams is stepping into a really, really good situation. I know Jamarcus Shepard through the spring months, very, very high on him, excited to get him in the room and just excited to kind of put him in this offense. And this, same thing we were talking about with Jeremy Bernard, like if Bernard's the X, do you put Ryan Williams in the slot? Is he, the other, does he play more of a Devonta Smith role, kind of like as that Z guy where he can, just do a lot of different stuff? Do you put Ryan Williams at X so that Jeremy can do a bunch of different stuff? They got a lot of different body types in that room, a lot of different guys that have a lot of different skill sets. How do they utilize that, right? Like we talked about that plenty during your Bernard pick, but I'm very curious to see how the receiver room comes together.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you made that connection. I think it's a great story for August and fall camp. So look for it on Bama 24/7 around the second week of August.
Boom. Make sure you're subscribed. 8th overall pick, my 4th. I'm going offense and I'm going Justice Haynes. I'm a little shocked that he is still here available in the 4th round of our most important player draft. But he Alabama running backs have been good, not great in recent years. Like Jahmyr Gibbs, I think has been, he had a better rookie season than he did his 1-year stint in Alabama. But here's kind of an annoying stat. Given Alabama's long track record with really good running backs, not so much recently, but they've had Derrick Henry, they've had Josh Jacobs, yada, yada, yada. Alabama running backs had just 3 100-yard rushing games last year. When you add in Jalen Milroe, they had 5 total. That's the fewest since 2018 when they also had 3 just from running backs, rushing for 100 yards in a single game. I know offenses have trended more and more toward passing the ball. That's kind of what DeBoer is bringing to Alabama, right? Pro style offense with some spread concepts. It wouldn't shock me in the least if Milroe is the starting quarterback, he gets run a lot just because I think that will, obviously we saw it open up the offense last year. I think DeBoer probably saw that and is going to factor that into whatever the play sheets look like week to week. It also would not surprise me if Justice Haynes, the big bruising running back, former 5-star guy, a lot of hype and, excitement surrounding him, especially now this year that he seems to be in line to be the dude or one of the dudes, gets a lot of run too. I don't think he's the second coming of Derrick Henry, but it would not surprise me if this is a guy that rushes for 1,000 yards over the course of the season. Like, especially if the interior of the offensive line and really offensive line as a whole comes together in the way that we can kind of picture it. He'll be running behind, maulers more or less. And then he's a big dude, man. Like he is like Justice Haynes, going to be hard to bring down. I doubt he's a dude that's going to go down on first contact. Like the reason he probably didn't play as much last year is the pass protection thing. He's going to have to get better at that. He also, every time we've seen him on the field, has had that big, bulky, robotic brace on his left elbow. Make sure his health is A-okay, especially during these summer months when he has some downtime. I know there was video posted where he's getting some work in back home, but, get healthy, kid, because I think he could be in line to be that number 1 running back option. He could be that guy in the 4th quarter when Alabama's up by a possession or two where you got to milk the clock, you got to pull the air out of the ball, give it to that dude 10, 12 times in the 4th quarter alone and just let him, 6 yards here, 4 yards there, 5 yards there. Like, I think he could be that dude for Alabama this year.
Yeah. I think the only thing keeping him from being one of my picks was just Jam Miller and kind of the unknown of how that gets split. They're kind of 1A and 1B. I think eventually we'll probably see one of them kind of pull away and be a little bit more of the consistent number 1 starter. But, for right now, I think it's still too close to call, if you will, in terms of who kind of gets the lead there. So I think there's a lot of potential. I think Justice Haynes' ceiling is certainly higher than Jam Miller. I think he's, there's probably a little more talent there. I think Jam Miller probably has a good year this year and goes to the NFL and is, mid-round pick. I think Justice Haynes has a really good year. Another really good year after that, he could be, I think fringe first-round pick. I think he's that level of player. Just kind of limited by the NFL not really picking running backs in the first round, but the ceiling.
Don't tell Detroit that.
Yeah, that's true. The ceiling is just high for
Right.
Justice Haynes. So yeah, I think it's a good pick on your end.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other thing too is like, maybe something that I want to see from Justice Haynes, what I think would really unlock his potential, catching the ball out of the backfield, right? Like that's something Jam Miller did very, very well last year. Like they would try to run that, swing wheel route to him multiple times during the year. And then they finally connected on it in the SEC championship game. Right. So that was a really big deal for them. That might, based on DeBoer's offense, or at least what we know about it and what we think he's going to bring to Alabama, that could lead to Jam Miller getting a little bit more playing time. He got more playing time last year because he was able to pass block. So that might, early in the season, that could be, Jam Miller is, running back 1A, right? While Haynes is more 1B to begin the year. But I think that's just, something that'll come with experience and more playing time. And I don't know. I think Justice Haynes reaching his full potential, I think goes a long ways, or at least is part of the formula to this Alabama offense reaching its ceiling in 2024.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Number 9 overall pick, most important Alabama player. You got one last pick. I think you just need a flex. Yeah, you're good. You're open.
Yep. I'm going to go with Keanu Cott.
Whoa.
Because I think, again, I feel like I'm a broken record, but I understand that's this time of the year. We've talked about it on previous shows for our loyal listeners that I think pass rush is a potential problem area for this team. I think losing Chris Braswell and Will Anderson, Chris Braswell and Dallas Turner after losing Will Anderson the year before is, there's not an obvious replacement on this roster. They kind of had that little pipeline for a while. Now, you're kind of looking at some players that are less proven, much less proven. Quandarius Robinson has been around for a while. He's been a special teams guy. I don't know what sort of pass rusher he's going to be in the SEC. Like, is he going to be still at that level? I think the guy with the higher ceiling is Keanu Cott, but Keanu Cott's also in his 4th year. So if he's going to show it, then now he can do it. Because he's been talked about. Dallas Turner was at the NFL Combine in February talking about who are the freaks on this roster. Keanu Cott, his name came up. Other guys said the same thing. I think even Kane Womack used the word freak when he was talking about Keanu Cott. So the athleticism is there with him. Again, a fairly highly recruited player, was top 61 in the 2021 class. He's kind of just hung around the last couple years, hasn't played a whole lot, has gotten on the field and shown a little bit. He has the body to do it. So if I'm expecting one of those two guys, whether it's Robinson or Keanu Cott to be the better pass rusher, I'm probably expecting it to be Cott just because of his skills, his physical skills. But he's not overwhelmingly big. He's 6'4", 230, 232, which is, a good deal smaller than what Chris Braswell was last year. But he'll play that wolf position, which he's going to be standing up a little bit more. He's going to be dropping back into coverage. I know how much people hated that. With Pete Golding's system, whenever Will Anderson did that, you just hear groans across the state of Alabama. Like, why are you dropping pass rush into coverage? It's going to happen in this defense. Like, your wolf is going to be doing some different things. Like, don't expect him to have his hand in the dirt all the time and just be going after it. Like, he's going to be standing up. He's going to be setting the edge and run. He's going to be doing all this. So it may not be, first of all, there's only one wolf on the field most of the time, and that could be Robinson. It may not even be Cott, but if you get into sub packages, maybe you get 2 on the field. And then even then, are you pass rushing all the time that you are on the field? So it's that opportunity for when it comes, can he take advantage of a one-on-one matchup against an offensive tackle and win that and be a disruptive player? If they don't have that sort of guy this year, and they've had it the last few years, without a doubt, it's going to be harder on this defense to be disruptive to opposing quarterbacks. And it's going to put more pressure on Kane Womack to send blitzes. It's going to put more pressure on the secondary to cover longer with a young group of corners. So I think a lot depends on what they can do at pass rusher. And if Robinson and Keanu Cott are not showing it, then I think you might have to give some looks to the next wave of guys, really talented guys behind them, in Quay Rousseau and Yanze Pierre. So, there's going to be a window, I think, for Keanu Cott to show it. But it's not going to be a huge window. I think there's going to be a next guy up mentality if somebody can't do it.
Right. Yeah. Well, and just, I'm very curious to see what's really asked of the wolf position on a week-to-week basis, right? Because Saban's defense, right? The pass rushers just constantly sending pressure. I know occasionally Dallas Turner was okay with like kind of faking the pressure and dropping back to kind of read the quarterback's eyes a little bit. He's got a little bit more of that versatility. I think Saban compared him more to Donta Hightower than a Will Anderson, right? So like, what is Keanu Cott? Where does he fall maybe on that comparison scale? But then also like, what is going to be asked of him, right? Is he going to cover running backs more? Is he going to be able to kind of, pin his ears back and go? Like, that's really curious to see what is asked of that Wolf position. And then, like you said, who takes advantage of what's being asked and who can do it at the highest level on a consistent basis, because that's ultimately going to determine who's going to play that position more often than not. I like Keanu Cott. He just, in the few glimpses that we've seen of him, I can see the freaky athleticism. He doesn't remind me of Dallas Turner per se, but there are things that, I can see some similarities, I guess, just what he's able to do, the versatility there. We just maybe need to see it on a more consistent basis, right? If he's going to be in that same level as like a Dallas Turner. I don't know that the pass rush expertise is there, but I see the big wingspan. I see the speed. I see the ability to kind of blow through guys that are maybe considered lesser than players compared to him. And you get excited about his potential a little bit, but it's also just something like, I got to see more of it. I got to see more of it. And I got to see it on a consistent basis before I really truly believe in it.
Yeah, and Womack's defense hasn't really produced kind of that standalone edge rusher that's like your guy. I mean,
it's not a defense that gets a lot of sacks.
Right. I was looking at their stats. 2023, their leader in sacks had 6.5, and he was an inside linebacker. 2022, their leader in sacks had 6, and he was more of a defensive lineman. 2021, their leader in sacks had 4.5. And they had a lot of guys with sacks, like 4.5, 3.5, 3, 2.5, 2.5, 2, 2. It might be more spread out. It may not be just one guy, but overall, the pass rush may not be as ferocious as kind of we've come to know the last couple of years with some of the really, really, really good players that they've had at that position.
Yeah, I'll finish this note before I make my last pick. Alabama finished last season 39 total sacks, and the 3 leaders, Turner, Braswell, and Aboigbe, 10, 8, and 7 respectively, all gone. Who's going to replace that, right? Is it going to come from the tackles in the line? Is it going to be from, that bandit defensive end position? Is it going to be from the Wolf, right? Kane Womack's defenses at South Alabama only ever cracked 30 sacks in a season once, and that was 32 in 2021. So he's got more talent now than maybe he's ever had before. He's cracked that joke plenty of times during the spring months. Will it translate to similar production?
Well, he's also not playing Sunbelt offensive line, so it kind of goes both ways. This is true. So,
he's unless he wants to stat pad against Western Kentucky and South Florida, which is entirely possible.
You play LSU, you have potentially 2 first-round picks at tackle, and Emory Jones and Will Campbell. So, I mean, again, that's if you're talking one-on-one matchups, you have Q Robinson on one side, you have Jamarian Latham on the other. Are they going to win those matchups against offensive tackles that are NFL players next year? Like, that's the big question for me.
It's a good question to ask. Final pick in our non-quarterback draft here. I'm going with, I still have to pick my freshman, and I'm going with Xavier Brown. Mm-hmm. He ran basically as, cornerback 2 through the spring months. It was him and Damani Jackson kind of running with the first team cornerbacks. He came to he's one of the 3 5-star guys, right? He joined the program with high potential. He's not really kind of the freaky athlete that Alabama has had at cornerbacks in recent years, like talking like Terrion Arnold, maybe a little bit more of a freaky athlete than, say compared to a Kool-Aid, who was maybe a lot more technically sound and just long and lanky. That's kind of how I view Xavier Brown, like very, very technically solid. And that's not coming from me, right? Because I didn't really get to watch a whole lot of spring ball because I was covering March Madness. That's coming from the 247 scouts, right? Like just very, very technically sound. He knows how to kind of make that first punch. He knows how to pattern match. He knows how to keep everything in front of him. He's not the freakiest athlete, but everything else that's asked of a cornerback, he does at a very high level for a freshman. So, if Damani Jackson's going to be that, kind of freak athlete on one side, I think you got Xavier Brown here on the other, and we'll see how much man defense I think is going to be asked of these guys. I think that's where Xavier Brown could probably shine the most. Probably closer to a Kool-Aid than a Terrion if we're going to make a weird comparison like that. But I think he's got an opportunity to play even despite, bringing in a couple more defensive backs from the portal. I think the coaching staff really, really likes him. I know I really, really like him. It could be a rough first couple of weeks, just given one, he's a freshman, and two, Alabama's got to play Western Kentucky, who likes to throw the ball around. South Florida has Alex Golish calling plays and Byron Brown, who's a pretty talented quarterback. And then they got to go to Wisconsin, where Tyler Van Dyke and Luke Fickle are going to throw the ball around a little bit. So it could be a little bit of a baptism by fire, but I'd like to think that Xavier Brown is good enough and smart enough to make the adjustments and figure out how to play high-level college football very, very quickly. I don't know. I really like this guy, and I think he could be an impact player for a few years for Alabama.
No, yeah. After that, you have Carson Beck, who's a first-round pick next year, and Missouri too, which they can do some things offensively. So
and then they got to go. Like we did this on the the scheduled draft too. You got to go to Nashville to play Vanderbilt, whatever. But Diego Pavia's he's kind of a menace when it comes to playing. Really,
he just beat Auburn last year, right?
Right, yeah, New Mexico State. So they play a pretty mean string of quarterbacks here this season. So they got to go to Oklahoma and play Jackson Arnold. LSU's going to have Garrett Nussmeier. I think I need to see a little bit more out of him, but right out of Baton Rouge is that a lot of people really like him. So
Tennessee with Nico and that offense can be interesting. We'll have to see. It probably puts more stress on the pass defense than it does the run defense, the schedule, to me at least. Maybe you get to Auburn like last year and run defense all of a sudden gets exposed, but I would be more concerned about those early teams passing the ball, especially in September.
Yeah. Well, and like we just kind of ran through the list of quarterbacks and, corresponding receivers that they're going to have to play as well, too, right? Dominic Lovick out of Georgia, Brew McCoy out of Tennessee, Luther Burden from Missouri, who, might be the Biletnikoff winner this year. Kyron Lacey from LSU. Like there's a lot of really talented. Cam Coleman against Auburn at the end of the season. A lot of really good receivers that these guys are going to have to, play against. So tests early and often for guys like Xavier Brown and even Keon Sabb. So there's a reason I got 2 defensive backs on my player draft. To recap, because we are only drafting 5 players each. Mike, you have Caden Proctor, Jeremy Bernard, Deontay Lawson, Ryan Williams, Keanu Cott. I have Tim Keenan, Parker Brailsford, Keon Sabb, Justice Haynes, and Xavier Brown. I don't know how exactly we're going to judge the winner of this. Maybe we'll circle back at the end of the season and see how everybody did. I'll make sure to make a note of this so that we can come back to it. But
please do.
Yeah. What?
Please do. Yeah, I feel confident I'm going to win this.
I don't know how we're going to judge fantasy points or something like that, but we'll have to, we'll circle back and discuss.
Scarborough judge our draft, and then I'll judge whatever draft you guys did and see how you guys did.
The scheduled draft.
Right. Independent. Well, that's actually, you can judge a scheduled draft because last year you can say what's your toughest game. I think I even ranked games. I think I ranked the SEC games from hardest to easiest entering the SEC schedule last year. And I think I actually had Auburn as the hardest SEC game, and maybe I was right about that one, but I think I had there was one in there. I think I had Kentucky higher than it should have been. That was an easy win. But yeah, there's a way of looking back and you can tell whether you were right or wrong. So I think we should do it.
Yeah, no, I'll make sure to make a note of this and we'll circle back after the season. That's the beautiful thing about the content machine, right? We can always circle back and see where we were right or wrong.
Ask a question and then answer it, as they say.
Bingo, right? As you go about grading the schedule draft, just remember that I got stuck with Mercer and I made that game interesting. So I deserve some bonus points.
Tin Horn game 2.0.
That's all we had, Mike. This was fun. And I figured it would be fun once we eliminated the quarterbacks from the draft. But no, this is interesting. It's kind of fun to see kind of where our minds are at right now in late May. Maybe it'll change before fall camp. Maybe it'll change during fall camp. We'll probably have plenty of podcasts to circle back on that stuff. But here for late May, judging the importance of the players on Alabama's roster. This was fun, man. I appreciate you joining me.
I'm just glad it's May.
That's all we've got today, guys. We'll be back sometime next week to continue to fill the content void here through the off season. In the meantime, though, be sure to rate and review the show wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, even our Bama 247 YouTube page. Subscribe to Bama 247 and 247 Sports so you can get great content like this on a regular basis. As always, we appreciate you guys for listening, and we will talk to you all again soon.